Hi, this is Paul. Every time I travel to Europe, I see things, and these things jog my interest. This is the Prince Albert Monument in Kensington Park. It is an incredible monument. Um, you can see, you can just get a little sense. Notice the gold leaf going all the way up, the cross at the top, the angels coming down, the church-esque feature with gold leaf Prince Albert and all the people underneath. And on the corners, you have continents where the Dominion of England is. There's the bison and godlike 19th century godlike. If you just go back and look at American coins, you can see all of these figures. Of course, coming in the 20th century, they get swapped out for presidents. It's quite a monument, and just really quite something. And it gave me, I did a lot of monument looking, and it gave me a taste for, I want to know more about this history. I want to understand what kind of civilization produced this. And it's, you can really tell how the civilization changes when, let's see if when you get to the First World War monuments, they're just somber. And so one of the things that I did was I started picking up some books on the Victorian era, and right now I'm going through David Canadyne's The Victorious Century, United Kingdom 1800 to 1906. So we're going to talk about lion culture and fox culture. I opened up YouTube after moving chairs for the for a funeral that we've got tomorrow at church, and noticed that Aaron McIntyre has grabbed onto the lions and foxes theme.
Two main personality types among ruling elites, the foxes and the lions. Foxes govern through manipulation and innovation, while lions rely on tradition and force. In a healthy civilization, power circulates between these two types, allowing a balance that meets the needs of society at any given time. For decades, Western nations have been dominated by foxes, who favor manipulation over force. However, as populist movements began challenging their grip on power, the ruling class attempted to pivot to hard power.
Okay, and he had cited Wilfredo Pareto. Pareto, an Italian sociologist and economist, devoted a theory of elite rule that categorized political leaders into two main types, lions and foxes. Of course, Machiavelli also refers to this in The Prince. Lions are characterized by use of force and aggression to maintain power, conservative tendencies, emphasis on unity, homogeneity, and established ways, comfort with centralized hierarchical bureaucracies, populist xenophobic tendencies, preference for simplistic, uncompromising action over negotiation. Now you can feel these things at play now. I was listening to Grizz, Benjamin Boyce has Grizz on his channel, and for the first time I heard Alliance of Responsible Citizenship, and Grizz sort of pushes back on that and says that where are the people for the school board? Foxes are characterized by use of cunning manipulation, diplomatic skills, liberal and internationalist tendencies, emphasis on decentralization, plurality, and skepticism, discomfort with use of force, reliance on negotiation and persuasion. Just also caught a little bit, and this will pertain. Gavin Ortland just has a thing on England before or after John Wellesley. I think we are entering into a period now. We are seeing a transition from fox to lion emphasis. Now, they're always both at play, and they're always going back and forth. And this, of course, gave me an interest in the last time that really lions were ruling Europe, and what that meant. And of course, that sort of all collapses into the First World War. And in many ways, the First World War and the Second World War are part of the same whole. And then that emerges into the post-Second World War the Pax Americana, which is a really interesting mixture of lion and fox. First, during the Cold War, we have the struggle with communism. The Western democracies in the United States wind up on top of that. And then how the evolution that we've seen. I've been giving a lot of thought to the fact that actually the post-Second World War was a really interesting covert empire. Jonathan Peugeot, again, in that conversation with Vervaeke, talking about the sort of the twin sacred moments of Auschwitz and Hiroshima. One of the videos in books that I have not gotten around to is the question of how the bomb has remade our imaginary. And right now, in the chatter around the Ukraine war, the bomb is really governing in many, many ways. I also caught what was almost a throwaway line on Maiden Mother Matriarch with David Betts. Now, when part of what's happening is that everybody's talking about civil war, but as David Betts says, most people, when they hear civil war, they think like American Civil War or Bosnian Civil War. Now, their definition of war is different because they include, let's say, the Argentine Dirty War and the Troubles. And he includes these as sort of civil wars. These are violent struggles within nations where there is actual killing, but there might not be battlefields. And he made this comment.
So began to write with a colleague about what seemed to us the character of the form of politics which had come to dominate Britain, but the Western world more generally. We can go into this in more detail, but it occurred to us that this was a form of politics which was post-national in its orientation, which was essentially imperial in the way that it conceived of politics at the very high level to be not about the aggregation of individual wants and desires in society, but about the community level negotiation of the societal goods, essentially, which is fundamentally how empires work. It's not how representative democracies based on the citizen, kind of individual citizen concept, tend to operate. From about that period, I became more and more interested in the domestic scene as an arena of conflict that people in my field of strategic studies, broadly speaking, or war studies more specifically, should pay more attention to. During that time, for reasons that are now perfectly obvious to anyone who reads a newspaper, the issues that seem to be arising or coming to a head or surfacing in a big way at that point have just metastasized and become more visible, more divisive, more profound, more dangerous.
Okay, he makes this observation about a distinction between empire. Now, I did the video where Ethan came on the channel and said nothing about empire. And of course, Nate Heil was right on there too. And this, of course, is the backdrop of Paul Kingsnorth and Christian civilization. And so we've got all of these threads moving around. So Ethan was talking about kingdom versus empire. And I thought it was interesting where David Betts here distinguishes, let's say, a representative democracy whose job it is to bring forward the wants and needs of the constituency, and that's supposed to get played out in terms of the representation of the nation, versus the empire, where there's much more of a monolithic or oligarchical framework by which it's much more paternalistic because they basically say, well, the citizens themselves don't necessarily know what they need. We, the elites, we, the wise, we, the smart, know what they need. Now, when you begin to see this, if you look through this frame, some things come clear. You've got, let's say, the communists who were very frustrated by the fact that Western democracies weren't capitulating, and you had to sort of starve the Ukraine in the 1930s in order to sort of prime the pump on the revolution that would lead to basically the coming of the kingdom. There was a really fascinating conversation between Konstantin Kisin and his father, which I found, really quite interesting. And what's so lovely about, there's a father-son conversation, but the father has clearly been formed in a very different world than many of us were formed in.
Were you given a particular view of this unfamiliar Western world in a formal sense?
Well, the ideological message was this: we're socialists, we're right and good, we're heading towards communism, which is right and good. And they, Americans, Brits, French, and Germans, will also eventually come to communism, but they're on the wrong path for now. But the entire world will be communist one day.
What made communism good and right in this worldview? Why were we heading towards it?
It was thought of as the peak of human happiness. I've thought about this a lot, and in my opinion, communism is religion. It's a highly mystical religion. If people were angels, the best form of society would be a communist society. But if people are demons, the best form of society is different, namely capitalism.
Or we could say,
well, not demons, but semi-demons.
If people are people.
Well, here's a question.
There's such a thing as human nature. They're both good and bad.
Semi-angels, semi-demons.
Now, what's so interesting about this is that we've been hearing a fair amount, of course, from sort of orthodox perspectives. And even if you've sort of heard enough orthodox perspectives and you listen to this Russian talk and you listen to him about communism, you can begin to understand where orthodoxy and communism sort of have, there's some questions beneath, and then Constantine sort of comes out with a much more Western Augustinian Latin anthropology about just what are people. But the point here is that you can hear the imperial paternalistic emphasis beneath the communism. Now, part of my interest in going back and reading history of the Victorian era is that it's close enough to our culture. It's not so alien to our culture as, let's say, the communists or the Russians or the Orthodox, but it's close enough to our culture that we're going to be able to recognize some things. Now, Canadyne's history decides at the beginning of the book, he talks about where to start with this, the long 19th century. Of course, N.S. Lyons writes about that a little bit when he writes about the long 20th century. But he decides to start with the Act of Union. And of course, having just recently been to Ireland too, doing a little bit of reading and learning about Ireland and Irish history and their tensions with the English. It's very interesting that he starts there. So he starts with the Act of Union in 1800s. And then, now remember, right before that, you have the French Revolution. And the French Revolution not only launches these Napoleonic wars in Europe that England will participate in, usually by sort of banking these coalitions to try to contain France and finally defeat France, which they eventually do. But the French Revolution also, of course, starts a wave of liberalism into the cultures of Europe. And so England sort of has to deal with that internally as well, how to process this. I've been also listening to The Rest is History, the story of the Belgian Congo, which has also been fascinating. And it occurred to me just how late all this history is. This is not history that's a very long time ago. We're talking 19th, 20th century. This history moved quickly. And so it's very interesting in sort of the rise of this British Empire in the Victorian realm. And it does reach its peak during this Victorian history. Once France is sort of put down and England has their relationships with Russia. Russia is this great power with this massive army. Austria is still an empire to be reckoned with. Spain is already receding down and moving down sort of into the dustbin. The French have been put down a few times. I also read Katja Hoyer's book, Blood and Iron, about the emergence, the rise and fall of the German Empire, which is a very interesting book. So I've been reading various different lion cultures from this period, trying to get a sense of it. Now part of what happens in this period is that you begin with sort of the East India Company. I think I had one before this. Where are we? So you have the generation that finally beat the French at Waterloo. Even though the East India Company was ostensibly a trading enterprise, albeit with a very large army attached, the inexorable expansion of the territory it controlled meant that the company's employees and the British official who oversaw them increasingly came to see themselves as rulers rather than traders. So they basically are taking control of India, and they want to do so. They also, of course, have ideals. There is a religions not only talk about how we will rule the world, but religions orient us to the higher. That's what religions sort of point to. And so there is within all of these colonial movements a sense of religion in that it's their duty, like Russia's duty was to eventually have communism rule the world. It's their duty to have sort of their perspective on Christianity rule the world. So let's see. Sir Thomas Monro, who governed Madras between 1820 and 1827, believed we should look upon India not as a temporary possession, but as one which is to be maintained permanently, until the natives shall in some future age have abandoned most of their superstitions and prejudices, and become sufficiently enlightened to frame a regular government for themselves. More particularly, such men believed that it was by promoting Western education that the people of India could best be fitted with future self-government. As Mount Stuart Elphinstone, what a great name, the governor of Bombay from 1811, remember, I believe Tolkien was in South Africa. But again, he starts out in a colony before they moved back to England. The governor of Bombay from 1819 to 1824 explained, if there was a wish to contribute to the abolition of the horrors of self-immolation and the infanticide, and ultimately the destruction of superstition in India, it is scarcely necessary now to prove that the only means of success lie within the diffusion of knowledge. In other words, you can understand the American use of power now with sort of all the USAID files opened and the pressure put on, again, Africa and Asia to conform to sort of the American religious imaginary with respect to the liberation of various oppressed and marginalized people groups. It was such a neo-colonial move, but all under the guise of anti-colonialism. It's just a fascinating dynamic that we really saw sort of in the heights of wokeism. These views were held with a special conviction and determination by Lord William Bentinck, who would succeed Amherst as the Governor General in 1828, and who would drive through many determined policies of modernization and westernization, including the reorganization of the judicial systems, the restructuring of taxation in the Northwest provinces, the abolition of sati, the burning of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres. Is this sort of a proto-feminism where the patriarchy is, women are being marginalized by having to, kill themselves when their husbands die. The suppression of Thugi, a fraternity of professional assassins. Benting's tenure of office would be the most sustained and systemic assertion yet of Western proconsul power, with the aim of advancing what he regarded as the primitive South Asian society to the high levels of civilization epitomized by the 19th century British. So John Anderson, the former, I think he was the Associate Prime Minister of Australia, of course, has a YouTube channel that's been doing a lot of things. And confidence is what this is about. This is the confidence of lions. And he just had a video with Konstantin Kisin again.
Quite a nice break from everybody else, don't you think?
Well, I think it's extremely interesting. And it's incredibly important because we're at a tipping point. That's what we're at ARC, we're all recognising that a sense of declinism is setting in and we need to break that. There's no reason for us to go into decline. We don't want to go into decline. We don't want to lose our democracy. We don't want to lose our freedoms. We want to restore our prosperity. And I think that's not just in the interests of countries like yours and mine. I actually think it's in the interests of the world.
Of course it is.
In the end, when we talk about the liberal global order that's prevailed since the 1940s, it's prevailed because America has been strong enough to make sure it prevails.
Absolutely. And believed in its values, even if you don't like them. Right? They believe in freedom of speech. Europeans believe in restricting people's speech so that no one's offended. That's at a governmental level, right? At the moment. That's who you're choosing between. If you're choosing between America, the American administration believes in free speech and is prepared to accept sometimes very unpleasant costs that come with free speech, right? The Europeans want the opposite, right? That's the choice, right? And so this is a question of values.
Well, that's right. But there's an even bigger choice that I'm alluding to, and that is that if America loses its global dominance,
yeah,
what will the new global order look like?
Well, that's what I'm saying, right? Our values are better than the values that would be in place of those values if we were not the strongest civilization. So being strong has to be one of our values. So it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? And so, this idea that we should walk around and sort of keep ourselves small and, we have this weird thing. I know it's a British thing. Maybe this is a sign that I haven't fully integrated, but we have a debate in this country every time the Prime Minister of the country goes to some global summit on a big plane. And everyone's like, oh no, he's spending government money. I'm like, no. What you think Xi Jinping arrives on a megabus? This is a game. There's a game being played here. And people will treat you depending on how powerful they perceive you to be. And human beings are very shallow. And if you've got a big plane with the name of your country on it, people tend to respect that. Especially people.
How about a big plane with the name of yourself on it? Can't imagine who flies around in something like that. But you can feel the shift. You can feel the foxes receding and the lion coming to the fore in terms of what people are looking for. And again, it's confidence. Such were the official connections in the aftermath of Waterloo. Of course, we're the French. Between the United Kingdom and Europe, the British Empire, Latin America, and the wider world. But the nation's engagements with the peoples and the politics of the globe took place on many levels, beyond and below those governments, that were carried on in many different ways. Between 1815 and 1830, more than 150,000 Britons emigrated to the United States, many of them Scottish or Scotch-Irish, disillusioned in high taxes and war and by the agricultural depression and the industrial slump that followed. When you read this book, you see that this Victorian era that we tend to look back in very low resolution as just sort of this golden age. There were riots and violence and food shortages and people leaving, but the lion is just sort of brimming out and people are going all over. Even more Britons emigrated to what was called the British North America, but its vast territory contained fewer than 1 million inhabitants. Relations between the English speakers and the French were tense. Imports and exports were minimal, and the colony was a serious strain on the British exchequer. During the same period, fewer than 10,000 people left the United Kingdom for Australia, but under the governorship of Laken, Macquarie, New South Wales began to transition from penal to settlement colony. He constructed roads and public buildings, instituted a police force. Sydney became a substantial settlement of 10,000. A second colony, so another one over there surrounded by Perth, conflict with the Aboriginals. Emigration from the United Kingdom would grow significantly during subsequent decades, and it soon increased the latent tensions between British settlers and the French in Canada and the Boers in South Africa. And so Britain is just expanding. The United Kingdom also benefited from the rapid development of the American economy in 1815 and became the main entree pot of the New World's burgeoning trade with the Old. With British investment, the prime financial driver of westward expansion of the United States. Trade with South Asia was also increasing, in part because of the ending of the monopoly of the East India Company, which meant more businesses could participate, but also because the importing of finished cotton goods was replaced by the purchasing of raw cotton, which was good for the Lancashire mill owners, but effectively destroyed the indigenous Indian textile industry, which is why governments have tariffs to try to protect their industries if they can. Further east, company remained a monopoly with its China trade, for which Singapore soon became a major trading post. In exchange for silks, porcelain, and especially tea, the British traded opium, even though its importation had been banned by the emperor in the late 18th century. But by 1830, there were 1 million addicts, and the company sold 18,000 chests of the ostensibly prohibited substance to the Chinese middlemen, being drug sellers. On the other side of the world, Latin American opportunities also beckoned as independence from Spain and Portugal began lifting of high imperial tariffs that previously had been enforced, and during the early 1820s, Argentina and Brazil became especially attractive markets for British traders and investors, such as Canning had hoped. By the middle of the 1920s, the United Kingdom was more fully connected with more parts of the world as a trading and investing nation, as a maritime force and imperial power, than any other country on earth, and any other country had ever been. Yet it was still governed on what was in many ways a recognizable 18th century basis of family connection and a division between Whigs and Tories. So also often the party identities were far from clear. He talks about the Whigs and the Tories a little bit. The influence of the Scottish Enlightenment persisted via Adam Smith in the writings of the political economist David Ricardo, who, following his mentor, was a staunch advocate of free trade and opposed the Corn Law of 1815. Yet Enlightenment rationality had also been behind the American and French revolutions, which had only been subversive of the established imperial British and domestic French orders, but had also been godless revolutions no less subversive of the established religious order. The United States of America enforced a strict separation of church and state, while the French Revolution was an atheist but also anarchic, symbolized by the conversion of the Pantheon in France from the sacred church into secular mausoleum. These broader concerns took concrete form in an issue that preoccupied British writers and intellectuals of the 1810s and 1820s, even more than the politicians. Was the church and state constitution of the United Kingdom fit for purpose or not? Was it Britannia triumphant to be celebrated and safeguarded, or was it mired in old corruption to be reformed or even overthrown? Behind these questions and their alternative and antagonistic answers lay the shades of Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, who seemed almost reincarnated during the 1810s and 1820s in the persons of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Jeremy Bentham. Together, they were for their generation the embodiment of what by this time had become the competing creeds of Romanticism and Rationalism. Talks about Coleridge and Bentham a bit. Coleridge had an animating spirit of the state that solely sort of emerges, but the very different perspective of Bentham argued in a pamphlet published 1818 that the reform of Parliament was essential, for only if elected on the basis of universal adult male suffrage could the legislature carry through the sweeping program of change that was urgently needed. By then, Bentham was gathering around him some able followers, many of them based in Bloomsbury, who would become the animating force behind the Westminster Review, established new colleges. For all the divergent and discrepant visions of British society, Bentham and Coleridge both thought and wrote, like most of their contemporaries, within an essentially Christian and religious framework. For utilitarians and Coleridgearians alike needed a God, and they took his existence for granted, even if they disagreed as to his identity and purpose. In the one case, he envisioned as a mechanic who wound the clock and kept it going, and in the latter case, he was more of a weaver who held the fabric of society together. Either way, he was essential, and this shared assumption pervaded and contained the many other religious disagreements of the time. Within the Church of England, high churchmen believed that Scripture was the repository of divine knowledge. They stressed the necessity of church attendance and the sacramental and sacerdotal aspects of religion, and believed that the purpose of worship was to proclaim respectability and to maintain the established social structure. By contrast, the Evangelicals were more concerned with conversion, faith, and enthusiasm, and with the issue of slavery, although they too shared a commitment to law and order. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 had not led to an improvement in the condition of those who were already slaves, and in the spring of 1823, such as prominent middle-class evangelicals William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and Zachary Macaulay established the Anti-Slavery Society, the aim of which was the immediate improvement of the condition of slaves and the ultimate abolition of slavery itself. A second evangelical enthusiasm, fueled by the popular religiosity and patriotic feeling generated by the wars against France, was for conversion work overseas. The 1790s and 1800s had witnessed the establishment of many missionary societies, and in 1813 the reform of the Charter of the East India Company meant that for the first time missionaries could work on the subcontinent. By 1821, the collective income of the British missionary societies amounted to £250,000 a year, and during that decade the so-called missionary frontier in South Asia on the west, southern coasts of Africa, and the Antipodes was a dynamic and expanding as the imperial and mercantile ones. Despite these undoubted signs of religious energy and engagement, drawing on the revived popular Protestantism stimulated by the French wars, there were many indications that the established church was failing to respond to the challenges of the time. By 1810, there were widespread and well-justified fears that the Church of England was no longer engaged with the growing population in the rapid expanding towns and cities of industrializing North. In mushrooming communities such as the 19th century Birmingham, the provision of church space for the majority of the population was lamentably inadequate. Not enough churches for the people. Because, of course, this is also a societal government thing. The provision of church space for the majority of the population was lamentably inadequate. By 1821, that town boasted a mere 5 parishes to accommodate a population growing by 30% per decade. Indeed, in many of the new expanding urban areas, there was church accommodation for scarcely 1/10 of the population. Among high churchmen and evangelicals alike, there was a serious worry in the aftermath of Waterloo. And once the French had been finally beaten, there was a growing feeling that more churches should be built, not only as urgent religious necessity, but also as national thank offerings for victory. In 1815, the Reverend Richard Yates published a pamphlet entitled The Church in Danger, pointing out the deficiency in the provision of places of public worship. But where was the money to come from to deal with this problem? In the countryside, benevolent local landowners might provide adequate accommodation. But what was to be done in the industrial towns and cities, where such figures rarely existed, and where the local government had neither the resources nor the authority to intervene? At the end of 1815, the High Church Joshua Watson and the Evangelical John Boldler combined forces to send a memorial to Lord Liverpool urging the case that more churches should be constructed and at state's expense. At a time of high anxiety about the unprecedented national debt, this seems audacious and rather desperate suggestion. I go on about that a little bit, and you realize that there is a lot of corruption And so you've got real questions about the clerics. You've got the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Durham each enjoyed incomes of £19,000 a year, in addition to what there were literally palatial palaces of residence, while the 8th Earl of Waterbridge was from 1780 to 1929 a prebendary of Durham Cathedral, had 2 family benefices in Shropshire, and lived in Paris, surrounded by dogs and cats dressed as humans. As the Church of England was not only increasingly out of touch with the growing numbers of towns and city dwellers, it was also unacceptably privileged, wealthy, and costly. Indeed, one pamphleteer calculated that while post-revolutionary France spent a mere £35,000 annually on its church per million inhabitants, remember this is a government program, and of course this would, of course, you're going to have in Vatican I the Gallicans, which is basically the King of France ruling over the Church of France, versus the Ultramontanists, which imagined that the Pope as emperor would rule over all of the Catholic world. And the priest read in Italy only £40,000 per million inhabitants. The Church of England was an astonishing £3.25 million per year per million inhabitants, making it the most expensive ecclesiastical provision, in Western Europe. These figures were undoubtedly exaggerated, but in drawing attention to the Church of England's privilege and prerequisites, limitations and shortcomings, they must have motivated both reformers and critics alike. At the same time, various strains and strands of nonconformity were offering a more engaged and plausible religion compared to that provided by what seemed the corrupt and discredited Anglican establishment. Many of the leading businesses and entrepreneurial families were Quakers or Unitarians or Baptists, such as the Darbys of Coalbrookdale or the Whitbreads in Brewing. Among ordinary people, the most powerful appeal of nonconformity came in the form of Methodism, which had blossomed during the years of revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Wesley himself had died in 1791, having denounced the godless republicanism of the French Revolution, and having asserted his firm and abiding loyalty to the British Crown. He also consistently maintained that he had no wish to break away from the established Church of England. But the majority of the early recruits to Methodism had been workers, and at a time of falling real wages, and then they had been attracted and converted by what had been termed apocalyptic anxiety, namely the consoling and reassuring prospect of a paradise in the next world they would never know in this. It was the new converts, such as those who forced the drive to separation from the Church of England that took place soon after Wesley's death. The next upsurge in Methodist conversion and recruitment came in the early 1820s, but this was a very different time, and those who joined were from corresponding different backgrounds, more middle class than proletarian. By then, many of the working class Methodists had splintered and seceded as Primitive Methodists, Bible Methodists, Reformed Methodists, Independent Methodists, and those who remained in Wesley's original church were increasingly middle class in their background. So you've got all this going on at this period, incredibly dynamic change, and the empire is growing, but yet there's plenty of splintering beneath, but not unlike, let's say, the poly-denominational American Protestant WASP establishment. You've got enough commonality beneath all of that fracture with respect to, well, you've got these churches are very much national. And if you jump ahead, book that I mentioned a number of times, The Great and Holy War, how World War I became a religious crusade, the whole thing falls apart. You can see that, obviously fighting Napoleon, well, you're going to have lots of religious sides to that thing. And you had lots of religious sides to the fight in World War I, but it was very much seen in those terms. After the war, those terms are nearly completely forgotten. We see this move between fox mode to lion mode within the conversation about civilizational Christianity. We see it within the conversation about dread Christian nationalism. We see it in the movement to, oh, let's reclaim older forms of religion, religions that had civilizational had civilizational clout. Now again, we see this on this side, and in places. One of the things that I noted was, how are these things going to go in places where, for example, the United States, the civilizational religion, you can still find the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. You can still find on campuses of the late 19th, early 20th century colleges a cathedral at the center of the campus. You can still find that. So many changes have happened sort of underneath, but yet now we seem to be turning. Let's see what Sky News does with this.
Jed, that's come from YouTube. The question is Trump way smarter than everyone thinks? You know, this idea of the madman theories, all this sort of stuff. I mean, on the point that you were making just then, it's hard to be in the same place, following the same path with a person who is going by this madman theory, because you have no idea where they're going to go to next.
Yeah, the madman theory of politics. I mean, Richard Nixon used to say that. They all think I'm a madman. It's not bad, is it? Yeah, there is a logic to it. I mean, he likes to be unpredictable. He likes to be people to be frightened of him and frightened of his unpredictability. So I always say it's the same mentality, and I'm not abusing him now. I mean, we owe him the respect of being the elected president of the United States, and that's considerable respect. But he has the same technique as the mafia boss, which is that he wants to be feared. He wants to insult people near to him to show how powerful he is to the others. I mean, he's either a mafia boss or a medieval monarch, and he likes all of that power. And he sees power as a personal thing. He doesn't see it as institutional. The power is him, Trump. And it's not, the presidency as such. It's not the American institutions. He doesn't like institutions. He particularly doesn't like international institutions because they're constraining.
It comes through in his language sometimes. He talks about me.
Me, that's right. And all of his officials, they say, the Trump policy. They don't say US policy on this. They said President Trump's policy on this, President Trump's belief on this, and they parrot exactly what Trump wants to say. And I was talking to a couple of journalists earlier today, a couple of Japanese journalists who'd just come back from Washington, and they were saying that it was interesting in Washington that they say all the statements that are made by the State Department and the Defense Department are made with only one member of the audience, to him. Yeah. Right? They don't make them to the international press, even if they stand in front of the international press. Everything they say is what they think he.
There's something very monarchical about that. You can look in Os Guinness's old back catalog, the audience of one. And so obviously with a religion, you have all of that updraft. And, as I pushed back on Ethan in the live stream on last Friday, I talked about the fact that empire, if you walk through the Bible, this is what's going to make it's going to be so interesting to see what Peterson's seminar does with Revelation, because Revelation is both anti-imperial and asserting divine imperiality at the same time. And there's so many of these cross pressures going on right now.
You will hear, and that's what they want. Now, that's his style. It's not without its advantages, and it is possible. It's possible that because he's playing for a bigger reality here with a partnership with Russia, that the Russians will think, look, let's go along with this ceasefire. We can deal with Ukraine in 5 or 10 years' time. While we've got Trump in the White House, let's just go along with this. And that his carrots and sticks approach, all the carrots to the Russians, all the sticks against the Ukrainians, might turn out to be the only thing that will produce a ceasefire. And I think we've got to give that idea some credence, even though it sticks in the throat when you think about who's right and wrong in this war. But it is possible that he has done something, as in a way he's done in some respects in the Middle East, only in some. He's done things which Joe Biden could not have done because Biden was a more traditional president.
I mean, perhaps we wouldn't be talking about the ceasefire at this stage if it wasn't for the way that Trump has behaved in the past few weeks. Another question about Trump as well, and it's kind of linked to that, Michael, but give us sort of a broader thought about this, because it's something that's running through my mind about the sort of the moral implications of this ceasefire deal if Vladimir Putin gets some of the stuff that he wants. The question comes from John T. Does Trump risk showing weakness at the highest level if he allows Russia to say no? I mean, Trump, as you say, mob boss, a gangsterish kind of way, doesn't want to show.
Now, it's helpful, again, to remember a thought that I said earlier, where we're living in a dispensation that the sacred moments come in the Second World War.
I think first of all, I totally agree with you, Paul. I think that, if we look at the sacred events, let's say, or the sacred moments and sacred spaces that have created our time now, I think of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and I think of the Holocaust. Like, those are things that I think of in the sense that they are massive human sacrifices that have founded the modern, like, let's say, post-World War II state. And the entire world order is based on those events. All our narrative, everything we say, is all based on those events. We still, even today, like, even Trump being elected is deeply ingrained in these sacred, let's say, stories. And so I completely agree. And that's why I present it as a kind of gray thing, like that the idea that the sacred is returning. It's both, it's like George Floyd was a little eruption of the sacred. It's like, here's a fast where everybody is locked into their house, a human sacrifice, and then an ecstatic explosion. It's like, oh, yeah, not sure we want that. But the thing is that in some ways, one of the things that is happening is that we're also exhausting the story. It's let's say, and it happens just naturally through time with people dying and generations moving away, and some aspects of the story that were also taboo people are trying to talk about it in different ways. And so this is demythologization of the stories is also going to happen of that sacred origin. And so we can see attempts at that now. We can kind of see it happening. We can see this poke. And so it's calling for another foundation. And so I agree that there's an aspect of it that is absolutely terrifying. But the problem is that it's going to these things are going to happen. Like, there's no like, for example, like this weird desire for World War III, like this weird, like, longing and dreaming of nuclear war at this moment, with a mix of fascination and terror that we can see in the eyes of people that keep talking about it. It's like, that's a longing for the sacred too, it's a longing for something that will just set things right. Like, it will make everything clear again, because now everything is muddy and nobody knows where they are and nobody knows what to think and nobody knows. It's like a good war, let's just put everything in place. And so these are all things that are happening, and they're all things that are very frightening. And that's why I keep harping on the fact that I think the way that Jordan presents it, is deeply a Christian way of thinking of it. It's like the cross replaced this with self-sacrifice. It is the sacred, like, it is both the ultimate sacred and the disarming of the sacred, right? In the way that René Girard talks about it, but then also, I think, in a way that Girard misses, because it is still anyways, there's something else going on in Jesus's cross that is not just a disarming of the sacred. It's a refounding of it in a way, in a deep way. So I think that it's weird, like, the only solution to avoiding a sacred event in the big sense is to enact it personally in a small way, almost like a kind of diffusion mechanism, like where we enact the the best aspects of the sacred in our lives and our families and our communities, and that can prevent the need for a new sacred foundation, which will be bloody. Like there's almost no other way for it to happen. Like, so I mean, you can imagine something. I mean, it could be something else. Maybe that's why Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, because he's looking for a sacred event. He's looking for something to refound us, something to give us a new direction, a new purpose. Maybe that's what's all these things are kind of bubbling up at the same time. But I agree with Paul that we cannot forget the what the sacred is and how it manifests itself.
And the sacrality, and then the religious pursuit. Mary Harrington writes about this quite well in her piece today. She's been sort of pursuing this with each iterative post. But the vision here is the utopian view survived as long as it did through the tangle of historic, cultural, economic, and political factors, some of which I'll try and explore below. But under Trump, the American hegemon has withdrawn sponsorship from that view and has already begun to dissolve from the top down. The world as it was will inexorably reassert itself. In this context, it behooves those who aspire to upholding humanist ideas in the context of what the world is actually like to think through the practical implications of this reality. What does it look like within our specific polities to try and plot a line to best fit between honoring our common humanity and accepting the reality that groups of humans sometimes have divergent political interests? In order even to ask the question in a non-demagogic register, we need to address the epistemic gap between the opposing viewpoints. So she's writing about post-nationalism. She's writing about how all of this emerged, undifferentiated human matter, and there are so many elements to this where Trump, who is ostensibly a nationalist, is in a certain other respect an imperialist. And you see both of these things coming out. America first, but if we can draw Canada into our sphere more closely through the use of carrots and other carrots and sticks, if we can draw Greenland into us, so it's both at the same time. There's so much of that going on right now. Her "you can't make me" argument, which was from not too long ago. I mean, Mary's been following all of this quite closely. So we are living in this really interesting moment. Now, the first 100 days of administration are sort of full of everything, and then very quickly the realities of governing start coming due. The real economy starts imposing itself. What will the stock market do? What will the bond markets do? What will the tariffs do to, Trump wants to reindustrialize America, but we all had a lesson in the supply chain during COVID that you're not simply going to turn a switch and have factories built. These all things take years, and Trump is not a man known for his patience with many of these things. So how will all this go as we go from, again, an age of foxes into an age of lions? And remember, it's not just one dominant lion. Russia is clearly trying to regain lion status. One has to ask if finally they will be up to the challenge. China is, of course, trying to gain lion status. And China has obviously been growing, but there are questions about its sustainability and actually the sustainability of all of these lions. And again, the lion and the fox dynamics sort of stay at the same time and move, where in many ways the Pax Americana was a lion in fox clothing. Now Donald Trump wishes to shed the fox clothing. But part of the difficulty of coming out as a lion is that you begin to lose some of the advantages that the fox has. So, again, trade-offs abound. Well, this was messy, and I just have to check one more thing. I thought so. Our lion and fox guy, Vilfredo Pareto, the Italian economist, sociologist, and engineer, is also the one to develop the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, which, of course, Jordan Peterson talked about a lot in his things. So, oh, those sneaky Italians. Yeah, this is a very messy video. There's no live stream this Friday. I have a funeral to do. So it's been a busy week. Hopefully I've got a lot of people sort of stacked up from my Europe trip that I want to get on the channel, but I've got to get some local things sort of under control before I can just sort of open up my schedule to lots of talks. So, but those will come. Those will come. And then I've got to get ready for Synod. So I'll be coming to Ontario, Canada in June. And at some point, I'm going to have to plan that trip. And then a question is going to be, do I plan in extra time for extra estuary work in Ontario? So we shall see. We shall see.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderklay, Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pajot. Midwestuary 2025, the Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.
Still I have it. There are moments I conveniently forget that I'm a 40-year-old man. The last vestiges of a ghost long dead. A ghost with a messiah complex. A messiah too lazy to rise or ascend. Happily hurt and hard. A hanger-on or haunting of a time past. A heroic dream of the harrowing of hell. Failure to launch. Cling to a life vest. Treading in spells that linger and last. Mom and Dad, righteous and mad, daydreamers with ghosts of their own. My memory of them stoic, looking with aims to pretend. Always on the brink of somewhere. Each a child dancing on the fence. On down the river. Dreamt in the sunshine. Saturday morning cartoons, the only Sabbath I knew. A disciple of Jim Henson and John Hughes. Worship in cathedrals where the Toys R Us. Baptized in ball pits. A clown served the sacrament we eat. More Pepsi and Pizza Hut. Say please. Say cheese. Between Kurt Cobain, a scrambled cable screen, towers tumbling, Super Bowls, and reality TV, the ghost is constitutionally unwilling and intrinsically unable to see and be seen, searching madly for attention to seek. But you could be anything. Never say never. If you've got nothing nice to say, don't say nothing, ever. Don't talk to strangers, see what I say, just do it. You don't listen very well, do you? You don't do very well, do you? You're not looking too good, are you? Keep up. Appearances aren't what they seem. Will you ever grow up? You look like you're stuck. I think you took too much. Echoes the ghost within the host, who prays the dead bury their dead and stay buried.